When hunger and blood cried out in the streets of Paris, a king sat upon the throne of France. Whispers traveled from mouth to mouth about him. He spends more time before the mirror than before the sword. This is the tale of Henry, a monarch who became one of history's greatest riddles. Was he truly a king, or a ruler who dreamt of becoming a queen? The evening of August 1st, 1589, was among the most mysterious nights in the history of France. The air was thick with the scent of sweat and burning candles. Inside the palace, the chambers lay as silent as dark tunnels, while outside, the streets roared, a chaos that seemed bound to end with the king's very breath. King Henry III sat alone in his private chamber. He was not merely a ruler, he was a riddle. Rings adorned his fingers, their gems catching the candlelight like scattered pearls. His hands wandered again and again beneath his garments, as if guarding a secret hidden from the world. Servants had long noticed something strange. Beneath his outwardly masculine attire, the king wore garments meant for no ordinary eye. Yet none dared to speak a word. That night, a Dominican friar named Jacques Clément entered the palace. In his hands he carried a small book and a gleaming rosary, moving with a silence so heavy that each echo of his footsteps on the marble floor felt like death itself approaching. To the world, he appeared no more than a humble servant of God, but within his heart, he carried a dagger. The king stood before a mirror, adjusting the folds of his black silk robe. A faint whiteness dusted his face. A thin line of rouge traced his lips. One of his attendants, hesitant yet bold enough to speak, whispered, "Your Majesty, these are days of war. Perhaps today you should wear your armor." The king smiled gently and replied, "If I must die, then let it not be imprisoned in steel. I will die in the freedom of silk." The friar stepped inside. The king looked at him, pausing for a moment, as if the man's soft voice or downcast eyes had awakened a memory of someone long gone. "Come closer, my son," Henry whispered. And as the friar bent forward, the dagger tore through cloth. But the greatest shock in that chamber did not come from the flash of steel. It came from what the blade revealed as it sliced through the hidden layers beneath. The faint perfume of silk, the jingle of pearls, the shimmer of delicate fabric that no king was ever meant to wear. The courtiers froze, breathless, their eyes wide, their tongues silenced, save for the question that thundered inside every mind. Was our king truly a man? Or was he dying with the secret wish of becoming a woman? Henry staggered. Blood and fragrance spilled together. Yet in his eyes there was no fear, only a strange serenity, as though he himself longed to unveil the truth he had hidden all his life. He turned, one final time, toward the mirror, toward the rouge upon his lips, the glint of pearls, the soft caress of silk. This was me. This was my truth," he whispered, his voice breaking. Outside, the bells began to toll, and the people of Paris went on with their lives, unaware that their king lay dying, leaving behind a mystery that would haunt history for centuries to come. Was Henry III truly a king who yearned to be a queen? Or merely a fragile monarch, condemned to scandal by whispers and rumor? Darkness fell upon the chamber, and with it began one of the most controversial chapters in history. It was the year 1551. Within the royal palace of Paris, a prince was born, Henry of Valois. The court rejoiced, but in the eyes of his mother, Catherine de' Medici, lingered a shadow of worry. She knew her son stood close to the future throne of France. Yet she also sensed something different about him. From childhood, Henry was delicate and refined, While other princes rode horses and practiced with swords, Henry found joy in perfumes, in chests filled with colorful silks and pearls. He would often sneak into his mother's chamber, standing before her mirror, his small fingers playing with trinkets and ornaments. When Henry was 9 years old, he vanished for hours. The palace fell into panic. Soldiers stormed the halls with swords drawn, searching desperately. At last, a maid cried out, "Here he is, the prince!" They rushed to her chamber, only to find Henry dressed in one of the servants' blue silk gowns. Golden combs gleamed in his hair, a string of pearls hung around his neck, and a faint tint of color shone upon his lips. "Don't I look beautiful?" Henry asked, with innocent delight. The room fell silent, his mother's face clouded with worry. But his father, King Henry II, erupted in fury. He seized his son before the court and struck him hard across the face, again and again. "What nonsense is this? Are you my son, or something else entirely?" His words dissolved into curses, echoing through the chamber as the young prince stood trembling beneath the weight of a secret that would never leave him. From that day forward, the young prince's life was never the same. Each morning he was plunged into icy water. Hours were spent drilling with the sword. Priests delivered endless sermons on the duties of manhood. If he cried, the punishments grew harsher. And before the entire court, the blue silk gown he once wore was set aflame. As the fabric burned, the fragrance of lavender spread through the chamber, a scent that would linger in Henry's heart forever, carrying with it a hollow ache. But no training could erase the truth. Inside Henry's soul, a secret world had already been born, a world where he felt free, a world without forced masculinity, a world where pearls and silks offered him peace. Time passed. The prince, under his father's will, learned to wield the sword, to ride on the hunt, and to show courage in the field. Yet in the stillness of night, when the palace lay asleep, he would stand before the mirror, drawing faint lines across his face with his fingers, as if sketching the makeup he dared not wear. Whispers spread among the maids. "The prince is not like the others. What kind of king will he become?" And when he walked past, soldiers often exchanged knowing glances, muffling laughter at his delicate ways. Then came the day his father, King Henry II, died in a tragic accident. In the young prince's ears, his father's words returned one final time, echoing like a curse. "My son must become a man, or the throne will never be his." But fate had other plans. The boy who was mocked for his feminine tastes was destined to one day wear the crown of France. And in that moment, history prepared one of its greatest riddles. Would the future king rise as a masculine hero? Or would the femininity he hid within eventually reveal itself to the world? As Prince Henry stood at the threshold of youth, the air of France was thick with war and conspiracy. Protestants and Catholics thirsted for each other's blood. Inside the royal palace, every day birthed new intrigues, new enemies. Amid such turbulence, the delicate prince often appeared to others as an enigma. Late at night, light and fragrance seeped from his chamber. Servants whispered among themselves, why did their prince not polish swords like the other generals, but instead sit before a mirror, surrounding himself with perfumes, strings of pearls, and silken robes? For hours, he would dust his skin with pale powder, trace his lips with rouge, then, before dawn, conceal it all, so that by morning the world saw only a warrior in armor, a prince with a sword. In 1569, at only 18 years old, Henry was handed command of the French army in a bloody war. Many believed this delicate young man would never endure the battlefield. But, to everyone's astonishment, he triumphed. With cunning strategy, he cornered the enemy general and struck him down. The soldiers erupted in cheers, hailing their prince as a warrior. Yet that night, in the solitude of his tent, Henry wept. Is this enough? Does spilling blood make me a man? The question trembled on his lips, unanswered. It was in those years that Henry began to wear two faces. The public face, a warrior, a commander, a prince worthy of the throne. And the secret face, the one that sought comfort in pearls and silk, in perfumes and mirrors. Fate, however, had greater twists in store. In 1573, the nobility of Poland made a shocking decision. They chose Henry of Valois as their king. The world stood in disbelief. The same prince who was doubted and whispered about in France was now to wear the crown of an entirely new kingdom. When Henry arrived in Poland, it felt as though the doors of his cage had finally swung open. Here, there were no old enemies, no stern father's shadow. At last, he could breathe. He handpicked 12 young courtiers of his liking, handsome faces, gentle manners, men of elegance and refinement. History would later call them the mignons. At night, they gathered in the king's chamber. Chests of silk were opened, perfumes filled the air, and amid laughter and whispers, a world came alive that outsiders would scarcely believe if they saw it with their own eyes. But the Polish nobles grew restless. They were hard men, seasoned by war, rough in speech, clothed in plain, heavy garments. To them, this French king was a strange creature. One courtier even wrote in a letter, "We asked for a king, but they have sent us a queen." Henry did not care. The revels continued. At times he appeared adorned in pearl necklaces, at others draped in white velvet robes. He even declared boldly, "Kingship is not kept only by the sword. It is sustained by beauty." But his freedom could not last forever. One day, word came from France. His elder brother, King Charles IX, was dead. The throne now lay empty. Henry must return at once. The letter slipped from his hands. He was about to leave behind his kingdom of dreams. Gazing into the mirror, tears welled in his eyes, yet his lips curved into a faint smile. For the last time, he clasped the pearls around his neck, drew the silk robe across his shoulders, and whispered, "If I must go back to France, I will carry this truth with me. They may strip me of everything, but my passion, my obsession, my truth, no one can take away." That night, under the glowing lights of the Polish castle, a final gathering was held. His mignons danced in shadows of silk and perfume, yet behind their laughter lay a quiet dread. They knew that in France they would not be welcomed with applause, but with steel. The people of France awaited their new king. Yet they did not know that their sovereign carried with him not only sword and rosary, but also dreams of pearls and rouge hidden deep within his heart. And so, the questions lingered. Would this king be able to conceal his feminine side? Or would the very passions that had blossomed in the freedom of Poland become the seeds of his downfall in France? When Henry left Poland behind and returned to France, the streets of Paris were alive. Not with silence, but with noise and anticipation. Crowds pressed forward, eager to glimpse their new monarch. Yet beneath their cheers stirred a whisper of doubt. Would this prince prove to be the strong leader their kingdom so desperately needed? Or were the rumors, whispered by soldiers returning from Poland, closer to the truth? The day Henry wore the crown, a soft chime of pearls echoed in the chamber. Courtiers nearest the throne caught a fleeting glimpse of shimmering silk peeking from beneath the king's robes. It lasted But an instant, but eyes had seen it, and suspicions deepened. From that moment onward, shadows of doubt clung ever tighter to his image. Henry began his reign in ways unlike any king before him. Instead of surrounding himself with hardened generals, he chose to keep close his favored companions, the mignons. Their hair was dyed golden, their faces delicate, their garments so costly they stirred envy among the nobility. They dined beside the king, they reclined at his feet, and in the royal court they flaunted airs and graces as though they were princesses themselves. The people of Paris watched in silence, their whispers heavy with disdain. Our king spends his days not with soldiers, but with courtiers who look like women. One day in court, a senior noble sneered, "Your Majesty, France needs a lion, yet what we have is a merchant of pearls." Henry smiled in reply, but the words cut him like a dagger. Still, he did not retreat. Instead, he transformed his court into a theater, filled with silks and velvet, where perfumes drifted in the air and laughter echoed through the halls. Yet behind that laughter, the game of politics never ceased. While France burned in the fires of civil war, Henry's court staged a spectacle. Outside, the people starved. Inside, the palace glittered with feasts, lights, and dances. Henry believed that beauty and refinement were symbols of power. His enemies, however, saw them as proof of weakness. And so, vile whispers spread across Paris. Our king wears women's clothes. He spends hours before a mirror, painting his lips with rouge. Is he a man or something else? These whispers soon became weapons. His enemies branded him an unmanly king, a mockery on the throne. But Henry refused to yield. He declared, "If they call me weak, then I shall turn my weakness into strength." With his beloved mignons, he formed a new military order. Their garments were delicate, but in their hands gleamed steel. To the astonishment of many, these so-called soft courtiers drew blood on the battlefield. And yet, the doubts of the people did not fade. To them, their king remained a riddle, a man who bore the sword by day and painted his lips before the mirror by night. This contradiction was his greatest strength and his deepest vulnerability. As the splendor of his court grew brighter, so too did the flames of civil war spread across France. His enemies made their decision. They would not only dethrone a king, they would bury a secret woven in silk and stained in blood. And the question deepened in every mind. Was Henry truly a king who longed to be a woman? Or was it all a conspiracy, an invention of his enemies to ruin him and steal his crown? By the time Henry neared 40, he had sat upon the throne for years, yet his reign was a kingdom of contradictions. Inside the palace, glittering feasts, velvet curtains, the soft faces of the mignons, and the lingering scent of pearls and perfume. Outside in the streets, hunger, poverty, and bloodshed. With each passing day, the people's resentment grew sharper, heavier. In his final years, Henry's court grew more flamboyant than ever. At dusk, velvet drapes fell across the palace halls, crystal chandeliers sparkled, and the king appeared among his favorites. At times he wore robes of gold, at others, strings of dazzling pearls around his neck. To many, he seemed less like a king upon his throne and more like the host of a queen's masquerade. But the city beyond told another story. In the streets of Paris, the hungry cried out, "We want bread, not pearls. We want a king, not a queen." These cries reached Henry's ears, yet he brushed them aside. For him, beauty was armor, his last defense, a fortress to conceal his weaknesses. But every fortress can fall. His enemies were not only among the starving masses. Nobles and priests alike plotted against him, believing his feminine nature had weakened the crown of France. They mocked his revels, whispered in corners, "This king spends more time before a mirror than with a sword." And so, in 1589, with France teetering on the edge of civil war, a secret plan was born. His enemies decided the time had come to remove him, not just as a king, but as a man whose very existence had become scandal. Henry heard the rumors, sensed the danger, but he laughed it off, hiding the truth behind his silks. That night, he gathered his companions once again. Music swelled behind velvet curtains, the mignons danced, and the king stood before his mirror. With delicate hands, he traced a faint rouge beneath his eyes. "Tomorrow is a day of fate," he murmured to his reflection. "Either everything will be taken from me, or I will live as I choose." He gazed at himself one last time, his white silk robe, a necklace of pearls, and in his hand a small vial of perfume. One of his mignons leaned close and whispered, "Your Majesty, you should be more careful." Henry smiled softly. If death must come, then let it come, wrapped in fragrance. The next morning, as the sun rose over the streets of Paris, the king knelt in prayer within his chamber. He wore the white silk robe. Suddenly, a young Dominican friar, Jacques Clément, entered. He asked for a private word with the king. Henry beckoned him closer. As the friar bowed, in a flash, he drew a dagger and drove it deep into the king's belly. A scream split the chamber. Blood spilled across the floor. Perfume shattered against the stone, and silk was stained crimson. Pearls broke loose from his necklace and scattered across the ground. It was as though history itself had painted its darkest portrait. A monarch draped in pearls and fragrance, undone in an instant by the blade of a dagger. The king collapsed. His breath grew shallow. From his lips came only broken words. Was I truly a king? Or only a dream? And with that, his eyes closed forever. The moment became one of the greatest enigmas in French history, a question that would echo for centuries. Was Henry truly a king who longed to be a woman? Or was it all a plot of his enemies, an invention to taint his name forever? In the streets, flames of rumor and rage spread swiftly. Some shouted in triumph, "The unmanly king is dead." Some women wept, "He was less a king and more like a sister to us." And many remained silent, as though a riddle had carved itself into their hearts. Upon the palace floor, the traces of silk soaked in blood remained. In one corner lay the scattered pearls, catching the light, glistening faintly, as if they were still alive. The death of King Henry shook not only France, but all of Europe. For some, there was relief. The unmanly king is gone from the throne. For others, there was only confusion. Who was this man, truly? A weak ruler, unfit for power, or a soul who struggled to preserve his identity against the cruelty of his age? After his death, a dreadful silence fell over the palace. His mignons scattered in fear, some captured, others vanishing into hiding. The halls that once glowed with light and perfume now drowned in shadows and stench. The pearls scattered on the floor remained untouched, as though cursed relics of a broken reign. In the streets of Paris, stories multiplied like wildfire. Some claimed, "Our king dreamt of becoming a woman." Others insisted, "It was all a lie, slanders spread by his enemies." But the truth was buried somewhere in between. Centuries later, historians still wrestled with the enigma of Henry III. Some wrote of him as a failed monarch, distracted by vanity and indulgence while his kingdom burned. Others dared to see him as a man ahead of his time, one who had the courage to live his truth, even as the world mocked and rejected him. And that is what makes his story linger in suspense. Was he truly a king who longed to be a queen, or merely the victim of a ruthless conspiracy meant to break his crown? To the common people of his day, Henry was never a figure of love. To them, he was the king who cared more for feasts than for famine, more for silks than for their suffering. Yet even among them, whispers survived. Our king was not like the others. He was different. And perhaps that is why he could not live. Henry's death left behind a warning to all who would wear the crown. A ruler who dares to defy the traditions of his time may rise as a visionary, or fall as a tragedy. Henry chose the latter path, but in that fall, his complexity carved him into history's most enduring riddle, an image that refuses to fade, a mystery still debated to this very day. In one corner of the palace, where his last vial of perfume had shattered, a faint fragrance lingered for years. Courtiers whispered of it as Henry's scent. It was a reminder that once there lived a king who wielded both the sword and the rouge. Perhaps that is his true legacy, a man forever suspended between two selves. On one side, the monarch who carried the burden of a kingdom. On the other, the soul who dreamed, whether of being a woman or simply of being free. The story ends, yet the question remains. Did history ever grant Henry justice, or will he remain buried forever beneath the name the Unmanly King?